From Print to Digital is the title of today's talk, and it describes a lengthy journey within the divergent In the Divergent Discourses project, we believe that the study of narratives emerging during that time can reveal how the world was then shaped and framed, ultimately leading to diverging discourses on Tibet that seem today still impossible to reconcile. As the conflict researcher Peter Coleman has explained, conflicts of all kinds are driven by stories. Once, and I'm quoting here, contradictory narratives emerge for each of the disputing groups and become promoted to unquestioned fact or truth. Those disputes often cross a threshold into intractability, unquote. But how do such narratives emerge? How much do these narratives change in their early stages? And how do they relate to the original events that triggered the dispute? This is what Divergent Discourses wants to understand. Researchers studying Tibet for years have faced the problem of closed access. In many, perhaps most places of the world, researchers can study these places' conditions and history, talk to people there, or consult archives. That generally isn't possible in Tibet. Since China took over Tibet in the 1950s, that has rarely been allowed, with only a few exceptions. And since the 2008 protests, the lockdown on research by foreigners has been almost total. In India, if accessible, archives are not created early on and are consequently incomplete. Then, what primary resources of information are there to know what happened in the past? That leads us to newspapers. They remain the closest what we have to primary written sources about conditions in Tibet. But that brings up a second difficulty: propaganda. Newspapers from within Tibet, since the arrival of the Chinese, are openly dedicated to praising and supporting a particular form of politics, that of the CCP. They are not primarily about what we in other societies might call news. They are instructions about what to say and think. They are about persuading, not informing. At the same time, in India, the exile community published newspapers promoting the exiled elites' views and usually thereby challenging the claims found in the newspapers published in the PRC. So during the study period, two types of newsprint emerged in parallel in two Tibetan communities, one newly under communist rule and the other in the South Asia-based diaspora. They both reported on events and concerns of the moment and shaped their separate discourses to explain and frame those events. So how do we use this very distinctive type of documentation, or how do we study it? We have a few methodologies that offer possibilities. One is comparison. By comparing newspapers from within Tibet with those from the exile community about the same events, we can learn to recognize a great deal about claims made by either side, how each side viewed and framed those events. That's likely to be very important in trying to understand how it became so difficult for the two sides to agree on the significance of events at the time or in the past, let alone to reconcile. We can study the newspaper's content by applying established methodologies such as qualitative content analysis, discourse analysis, or network analysis. But to be able to handle or process the mass of material of newspapers, we can also use the new methodologies of the digital humanities. That is text mining, corpus analytics, and all sorts of big data studies. These tools are largely untried so far in Tibetan studies, but they present possibilities for disaggregating different layers of information, such as events on the one hand and stories about those events on the other. Sorry. One way they can do that is what Robbie Barnett calls the grains of sand approach, sometimes or also known as prosopography. Digital technologies can identify hundreds of references to a name, place, or event or institution that otherwise might not stand out to a human reader. These connections then show patterns, networks, groupings, actions, and patronage systems, and link them to arguments. And this can then lead to new understandings of the studied period. But more importantly, digital technologies can help us identify and track discourses by semi-automatically classifying texts in large corpora. And before I show you some of the digital tools that the project uses, I want to give you an idea of the diverged newspaper corpus that we compiled. At the same time, this will also give you an overview or a rough summary of Tibetan newspaper history. In the Divergent Discourses project, we built a corpus of Tibetan language newspapers. The idea was, of course, to get as many papers as possible, but in order to get a consistent collection without too many and too large gaps, we decided to focus on the period of the 1950s, of 1950 to 1965. This period also roughly correlates with the formative period of the PRC, at least in Tibetan areas. And it also corresponds with sort of the beginning period of exile. At that time, the newspaper system in Tibet was still relatively young, and the first Tibetan language newspaper was published only in 1904 by Moravian missionaries in Leh, the capital of Ladakh. The first newspaper then to appear in Tibet, in Lhasa, was the Tibetan Vernacular News, which you see here on the screen, which was published in the final years of the Qing dynasty. Following the collapse of the Qing, during the time of the Republic of China from 1912 to 49, interestingly, no Tibetan language newspaper was published in central Tibet or within the authority of the Gandham Podang government, although Tibetan papers were published in China, for instance, in Beijing by the Tibetan Mongolian office. South of the Himalayas, the Moravians had kept publishing newspapers in the Tibetan language until the mid-1950s. However, the Moravian papers were by far less successful than the Tibet Mirror, published in Kalimpong from 1925 to 1963, of which you see a page here. This is also perhaps the best known and probably best researched Tibetan language newspaper to date, and it's also perhaps the first Tibetan language newspaper that fits the definition of a modern newspaper. And this is the characteristics, or the four characteristics of a modern newspaper are: first, universality. That means the newspaper should cover a broad range of topics. Then currency, these should be presented in an up-to-date fashion, so no old news should be published, rather it should be sort of new and up-to-date. And publicity, that means the newspaper should be available to a broad public audience, usually through subscription or shops. And the Tibet Mirror was sold not only in northern India among the Tibetan community or in Tibet, but it was even people, for instance, Professor Schubert here in Leipzig held a subscription, and also subscriptions were probably held in France or in the UK. So the Tibet Mirror was widely available. And the fourth category is periodicity, meaning that the newspaper should be published in regular intervals, usually daily or weekly or every 10 days. The Tibet Mirror was published on a monthly basis, though, and in later years, even this frequency moved towards longer intervals. However, given the economic difficulties and problems of distribution across high mountains and political borders, a month might be still acceptable for early Tibetan newspapers to still count as a newspaper. For our project, the Tibet Mirror is the earliest newspaper we collected, and it's an important paper for the Tibetan nationalist and anti-communist discourse, in particular before 1960, before the Dalai Lama and Tibetans came to India. So this is a list of the newspaper titles in the Diverge corpus, sorted into publications from India and the PRC. And it's perhaps important to note here that we have not collected publications from Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, or elsewhere, as we wanted to capture the Tibet-China conflict, and we wanted to keep it a little bit simple for the time being. For the period from 1950 to 65, we were able to collect and scan a total of 18 titles, which are all listed here. For practical reasons, we had to exclude those 5 titles which are gray here on this slide. One of these practical reasons was that one newspaper used to be there in the archive, but then had miraculously disappeared, and now we can't work with it, at least not until it reappears. So we thus ended up with just 13 titles that we choose to digitize. Here, when I say digitize, I mean more than scanning. I mean sort of all the processes of text extraction and making sort of available other tools for working with these newspapers, while scanning is just sort of turning the physical object into a digital object. So digitizing is some further steps ahead. So with these 5 titles from India on this list, we were able to digitize all of the newspapers published in India then, in that period. Of course, not all published issues, although we are getting close. Unfortunately, the 8 titles from the PRC here only represent a relatively small fraction of the newspapers published in the People's Republic, as most of these papers have not been preserved or are simply not accessible for us. And to be frank, we do not even know how many newspapers have been published during that period. That's far from clear. This chart here shows the proportion of newspaper issues in the Divergent corpus over time, and gives you sort of the proportion of newspapers from the PRC in red and from India in yellow. And it's important to see that obviously there is a strong PRC bias in our corpus, simply because we have much more material from the PRC than we have from exile. And it is always important to be aware that such imbalances in the collection introduce then, or potentially also introduce a similar bias into subsequent analysis. This chart, which could be much better, I guess, but it shows the distribution of newspapers in newspaper pages by year for the whole corpus. And what I want to show here is the more colorful a column is, the more different newspapers are available for this year. And from that perspective, for a synchronic comparison or a synchronic study of news, only the years 1954 or 55 and 59 seem to be best, as we simply have sort of the broadest range of newspapers only for these 2 or 3 years. And well, if you look at 1951 or 1952, then only 2 different newspapers are available, for instance. For diachronic studies or diachronic analysis, it is important to make a careful selection, as no newspaper is available for the full 15-year period. So only some or a combination of newspaper will allow for this diachronic analysis. In the 1950s, the PRC established a tight network of newspapers across the country to make sure its messages reach all corners of the vast country. Newspapers were published at all administrative levels, from national newspapers to provincial, prefectural, and occasionally county levels. The map roughly shows the Tibetan administrative units, covering 4 provinces and the TAR, sort of the areas where Tibetans live in the PRC. Like all media in the PRC, the newspapers were organized in a strict hierarchy, and any organizational or editorial decisions required the approval of the respective higher level. The entire production chain of publishing, printing, and distribution was centrally controlled by the Xinhua News Agency. Subscription was compulsory for government employees and institutions, and the newspapers were often studied in evening meetings to make sure that everyone understood the content correctly, even those people who were not able to read or write. China here, following the Soviet model, exercises positive control over newspaper publications, as the state maintained the total control over the press through staff appointments, so the selection of appropriate editors, editorial plans prescribing the content, and funding, and of course occasionally also post-publication evaluation, although sort of there is no real or no institutionalized censorship in the PRC. So if you look at these charts, the smaller one gives you an idea of the distribution of Tibetan newspapers according to the administrative level. So we have newspapers in our corpus from the provincial level, that would be from the Tibet Daily from the TAR, or sorry, or the Qinghai Tibetan News from Qinghai. Then we have prefectural level and county level. I have to admit, on the county level, we only have one newspaper and we only have one issue of it. So it's not really strong, but it shows that there is this distribution. There's also a different kind of newspaper published at the universities. We have 2 university newspapers that are kind of make a separate category in a way. And the second pie chart here shows you a distribution according to administrative regions, and the big red part is Tibet, or the TAR, and obviously we also have in the corpus, if we only look at the PRC, we still have a little bias towards central Tibet here. On the Indian side of the Himalayas, the number of newspapers naturally was much fewer. The Tibetans had first settled in the area around Darjeeling and Kalimpong, just south of Sikkim. That's the little square here on the map, where there long since had been a strong Tibetan presence. The area had been an Indian-Tibetan trade hub, and well-off Tibetan families used to send their children for English language education to missionary schools in the area. Also, the Tibet Mirror was published here, and the history of the Tibet Mirror here already provided kind of skilled people for producing newspapers, and Gyalo Dendrup, the older brother of the 14th Dalai Lama, could build on that when he first started his newspaper project with CIA funding in this area in the 1960s. Interestingly, until 1978, all newspapers were published in this area, in the Darjeeling area, except for one newspaper, that is the Central Weekly News, a newspaper published by the Kuomintang party in Calcutta, only starting from 1963 on. So again, some pie charts here. This the smaller one is not very surprising. It shows that almost all newspapers came from the Darjeeling area, and only one from Calcutta. And the other one, I tried to divide these newspapers up into categories, sort of describing the target areas of audiences, the target audiences. So most of the newspaper would be directed towards all Tibetan exiles or all Tibetans living in India, and a smaller faction would address Kuomintang members or those who sympathize with the ideas of the Kuomintang. And finally, there's one paper also that caters towards what I would characterize Tibetan activists. And I will show this here. These are the 4 papers that are published in India. And the first one, Freedom, is published by order of the Kashak by Gyalo Dendrup in 1960. And the second one here is published by Gyalo Dendrup and Lamut Sering, who is first Gyalo Dendrup's secretary and a close friend, but he is also the person coordinating the Tibetan resistance, and he was also the contact person for the CAA in the exiled Tibetan community. And he published this paper, Defend Tibet's Freedom, that in terms of content has a much more activist kind of voice to it. Well, these two papers were then merged by the order of the Kashak into Tibet's Tibetan freedom in 1965. This shows that both papers, well, were closely connected to the Central Tibetan administration. And then the one from Kuomintang in Calcutta, published from 1963. This is the first page, the title page of the first issue. Well, to sum this up, the corpus of the Divergent Discourses project consists of altogether 18 newspapers. 7 are from the South Asian diaspora, 11 are from the PRC. Altogether, we have by now 17,115 pages, but we are still getting some more pages slowly into this corpus. This corpus will be made online accessible via the Staatsbibliothek Berlin and across Asia, thanks to Antje and her colleagues, and this will hopefully be coming soon. And we are also hoping, where copyright allows, that this will be made available in open access. So let me now turn to the third part of my presentation. So how do we deal with this corpus? Although the newspaper corpus we compiled with its 70,000 plus pages, comparatively small in whatever compared to what other people do in digital humanities. Still, it is beyond a single person or a small project to read and study such an amount of text in a traditional way. That is, read through all the pages and make sense of each individual article. So we in the project thus spent the last 1.5 years, or a little bit more even, exploring the possibilities and tools digital humanities hold for us, or rather for an under-resourced language such as Tibetan. So in the next 20 or so minutes, I want to show you a few slides introducing our approaches to digitizing the corpus and highlighting the challenges we met and how we tried and how we want to overcome these challenges. We believe we have by now made quite some progress, but at the same time, this is a work in progress and we still have a long way to go. To start with, our goal is to have a newspaper corpus in the form of reliable e-texts, that is, e-text with a very, very high accuracy in order to eventually enable other approaches such as corpus mining or qualitative content analysis. On the way there, then, we met and are still meeting several challenges. The corpus at the moment consists of 13 different publications, as I just showed you before, and its material condition, or the material condition of each of these publications, lead to 3 major challenges when digitizing the material. We have at least 3 different languages, mainly Tibetan, but also Chinese and English. And they come in at least 3 different scripts with even more variations, such as cursive forms or different typefaces, or in the case of Chinese, horizontal and vertical, but also simplified or semi-simplified or traditional Chinese, etc. So there's many problems that come with these scripts. And finally, the publications all feature different layouts, different from each other, but also within one publication, the layout differs wildly. And one particular problem, as it turned out, was that newspapers have columns as a layout, which is very difficult for computer vision to deal with. One major, or the biggest challenge, however, is still, unfortunately, only very few digital humanities tools are available to deal with Tibetan language and Tibetan script. So to produce such a machine-readable e-text, we adapted and developed some tools and set up a digitization workflow that consists of 3 steps or phases, starting from the physical corpus of newspapers, either on paper or microfilm. So that would be the yellow square here. The first step then involves scanning and pre-processing. So the file formats have to be adjusted, and also the image quality has to be checked and maybe enhanced. To import then the newspapers or the newspapers' images into Transcribus, an online platform for transcription and information extraction. For this second step, transcription and information extraction, we trained 3 different models that help us to extract the e-texts from the scans. In addition to the e-text, we extract also some more information which we believe might be helpful in some other downstream tasks. Before we then start to analyze the corpus, we still have to do some post-processing that then better allow for the subsequent corpus analysis, which will be done at the moment. We are trying to work with, or we want to work with, 2 tools, one for corpus mining and another tool is semantic search. But let me now show you some of these steps in a little bit more detail. So the whole process starts with compiling a corpus of physical newspapers from various sources, usually in the form of physical copies or as microfilm or from microfilms. And what you see here is from a microfilm from the Staatsbibliothek. Unfortunately, this occasionally results in low quality scans, as you can see here. The reasons for that are many. So this microfilm was produced sometime before 2000, I think. So probably the equipment was not that good. And also time did probably somewhere on the microfilm, and then some sloppy handling of the photographing, obviously. But you can also see that the newspaper from which this photo was taken already had some issue with like watermarks, etc. So since we did not want, or we wanted to avoid evaluating all the images manually, so we developed a pipeline that classifies the images into fair and low quality images, which then processes these images accordingly using 2 different binarization algorithms. And we just made the script public on our GitHub, so if you want, you can have a look. There's nothing much new about it, but it seems to be working well with the newspapers. The results, as you see here, may not be optimal for each image. So one could probably get better results for the page, but they will ensure that most newspapers, or the most text in the newspapers, can be transcribed in the following step. So these pre-processed images, yeah, I will give the GitHub link, of course. So these pre-processed images are then submitted to Transcribus.org. Transcribus was developed at Innsbruck University to transcribe handwritten materials from archives, in particular, or usually ledgers, letters, notebooks, handwritten things, or real old texts with irregular writing. But it proved to be quite helpful for, text written in Tibetan, and in Tibetan studies, some projects are already kind of exploring the possibilities of Transcribus. So did we, and after some early successes with the HDR model to transcribe text, we found that the complex layout of Tibetan newspapers, as I have just mentioned earlier, made this task extremely challenging. And to overcome these difficulties, we trained 3 different models that must be applied on each page in the following order. And so first, we trained a field model for the recognition of text regions. This is what you see here, the pink, blue, red, and green. These are all text regions. And these must be identified in order to deal with the column layout of the newspapers. Sort of as a surplus information, we get information about what paragraphs or what text region that is. So we can now know what is a headline, what is a paragraph, what is other information, what is a section heading, etc. So all this information can be extracted as well. As a second field model then is necessary for the detection of line polygons. That is like if you look at the top text region, the newspaper title, you see this red thin line. That's the line polygon, and it surrounds each one line of text and makes it possible that the subsequent text recognition finds all of the text. As it turned out, if one follows other approaches, the ascenders and descenders of the writing are not always detected, and leading to corrupt transcriptions. So in Tibetan, that is usually sort of the vowel signs or superscribed letters, subscribed letters, especially yata, rata, shabju. These make transcription problematic, but using a line polygon model solves this problem, especially, and it also enables us to deal with different font sizes in the text. When this is done, we are finally going to the text recognition, and we have trained a model on some 400 pages of newspapers to transcribe the text. Maybe a note on these on the mean average precision or the character error rate. This is sort of how these models are evaluated. We have, for the field models, we have both like roughly 50% accuracy, which sounds rather low, but probably we lose a lot about on the correct tagging of these regions. So text extraction would work well, while we will have mistakes on what is publishing information, what is a headline, etc. Then the character error rate is usually, it said if it's below 10%, it's quite good and ready for production use. Our models now range below 4%, so that is already quite satisfying for us. Then post-processing, of course, we extract the text, and we have to do normalization and some enrich with metadata, remove line breaks, etc., before everything is then brought into our tools for analysis. So for the analysis of our corpus, we plan to use two tools, and we are currently experimenting with those. First, a semantic search, and then the ILCM, the Integrated Leipzig Corpus Miner, which was developed here in Leipzig for a different project that studied newspapers, and which bundles several corpus mining tools such as core currency analysis, topic modeling, supervised text classification, etc., with a user-friendly interface. And I think this is what researchers like me, who do not want to work from the command line or do not know much Python, etc., that is a huge advantage if you can focus on the analysis and not on the code behind it. But again, there are a few challenges because the ILCM is dependent on SPACY, which is an industry standard natural language processing library, which, however, doesn't support Tibetan language. So we needed to create a SPACY model for Tibetan, which requires large amounts of training data, which did or does not exist for modern Tibetan. So again, we had to create the training data, but lacking both funds and people in the project to produce such amounts of training data in a short time. We then tried the new generations of generative AI models for annotating the training data in order to get like a basic spacey model. Also, this was difficult because we had to first evaluate what these AIs do, ChatGPT and Google Gemini, etc. And we found that ChatGPT is not good for Tibetan. However, Google Gemini's Pro model was good enough, and so we produced 120 megabyte of part of speech tagged data, which then allowed us to train a spacey model. For real good results in corpus mining, one would also need named entity recognition. Of course, this also needs more training data, which we are now trying to create and then add to this model, but we are just working on that at the moment. Eventually, we were able to train such a Tibetan language model for spacey and then could try the functionality in the corpus minor, of which you see here a screenshot. And what I did here is, I hope it's big enough, but anyway, it doesn't matter. What I did here, we took a sample corpus of text from the Tibet Daily from the internet and processed it in our to make it available in the corpus minor. And then I searched for Benjor economy for a subset of text, and then had the corpus minor do topic modeling on it. And what you see here is sort of the information on topic 3 in the corpus minor, which gives you, I think, 30 sort of most relevant terms that describe the topic. And now one can look at the topic and see what it is about. And I did that by looking at some terms and translating them for you. So this topic 3, it is all about feudalism, the combined religious and secular rule. So that's kind of the traditional Gandhi-Podang government. But then also we have dictatorship or autocratism. We have talk about imperialist country or countries, capitalism and exploitation. And so this clearly seems to me to indicate that this topic is about, well, the old Tibetan society. And then, well, I don't know, some other words say happiness and so on. So maybe also about the happiness that now exists in the new Tibetan society. And I would now like to quickly share with you a live example of the corpus minor. Just, okay, can you see that now? So this is the same screen, but it's in the corpus minor. And now I show you a problem we have. So if we go down here, it gives you the title of the most relevant article, and obviously the corpus minor here is not capable of reading Tibetan as of yet. So this is the smaller things that we have to do. But what you also can do, you can download sort of all topics of all articles or all documents that belong to a topic, and then further analyze it. Also here, this is, of course, it's very small, make it a little bit bigger, but here you can also change. So you have all the keywords, and you can look at what is in other topics, but then you can change a little bit here the relevance metric. Usually for English or German, it would be 0.6 to get rid of kind of irrelevant entries. But as you can see here, Hang, I, Gi, this is not very relevant for the content. So I moved it here. and it turns out to be quite relevant. Yes, so let me return to my presentation and to our second tool that we want to use to explore our corpus, which is a vector-based semantic search tool. We assumed that turning our corpus into vectors would possibly yield better search functionality than standard keyword search. And looking for available options, we discovered that the commercial provider of vectors, Cohere, supports Tibetan language in one of their multilingual models. And there are two striking advantages in using such a multilingual vectorized search tool. First, we can now search our corpus in theoretically any supported language, and we will get results in Tibetan. So we query the corpus in English, and then the Tibetan results from the corpus are displayed. But more importantly, the search will not only return results of a keyword search, but also semantic search. That means if we search, so very simplified, it means if we search for ship, this would also return results including boat, ferry, water transport, etc. And this is how it looks. A very simple interface, not very, and it's just sort of what we experiment with. And I also want to show it to you in, in a live thing. So this is the search screen. So you see here is Tibet Daily. Then you have a range of only 3 years, so it's very limited. And then I can copy here, for instance, an English search query. And the interesting thing here is the query should be rather long, and it can be a whole paragraph or a long sentence. And then it searches, and if it was a Tibetan query, I could translate it. Of course, English to English, it remains the same. Then I toggle it to the formatted display. So you see here are the results returned for this query in English. And to make it a bit easier even, we can translate that simply with a Bing machine translation. And you see that relevant results come from this English query. I can also try quickly show you what happens if we do that with a Tibetan sentence. So this is a longer Tibetan sentence. Let me just switch that off in order to make it, I think that will make it a bit quicker. Okay, so this is already done. That was fast. And then, so you see, here is the translation of this sentence. And since the sentence is from the corpus, sort of the first results are the complete text, but then now we have to wait a little bit for the English translation. And then you see we can have more results. So this little section is kind of a narrative about like an official Bempa Tsering, how he worked hard during the epidemic. And so what this brings back is a lot of similar narratives. So here's a Sangdru, so Samdrup probably, etc. Lobu, etc. What they did during Tsering Phuntsok's, and so on. I have to try to find back to my presentation. Yes. Yeah. So thank you. This is how far we got so far in this Divergent Discourses research project. Please visit our website here. This is where we have links to our datasets, code, and also publications. And we will have a forthcoming publication soon in February, which deals with in RET, and it will sort of explain in more detail all the tools and approaches that we have developed over the past 2 years. Thank you very much.